Okay, good morning, everyone. I'm Nicole. Oops. I'm Nicole. This is the Trust Effect, and it is Tuesday, June 2nd, 2026. And I'm so happy you're here today. I'm trying out a new microphone, so I have no way of knowing if it's connected. I don't know if you can hear me, if I'm loud, if it's normal. We're just kind of crossing our fingers and we're gonna see how this carries out. Um, so when I was thinking about what I wanted to talk about today, um, I had to reflect on the last, I'd say, 7 days that I've had. And I don't know about any of you, but the energy has felt different. There's something in the air right now that is is indicating to me that there's a lot of change afoot, that there's a lot of, I think, motion happening under the surface that we might not be able to put our finger on. And I was thinking about some of the work that I've been a little more public with, some of the radio appearances that I've had this week, where I've disclosed information that to me just feels normal. It's in the public record, it's things that everyone should know, but also feels a little vulnerable to share in the sense that because I've made a habit of making the unseen seen and saying the quiet parts out loud, sometimes when I say things that feel very normal to me, I realize that they can be a massive revelation to other people. And then all of the stories come in and all of the crunchy bits come in, and I start to feel a little exposed, a little too visible. And I have to do a lot of nervous system work. And what became really interesting and obvious to me over the last couple of days is that through this journey that I've been on and through the work that I've been creating, specifically with Sovereign Wealth, and the 4 conditions in field literacy, is that I've become really, really good at becoming like this forensic investigator when it comes to trust and how trust breaks. But I'm not always so great at quickly identifying where it's working really well. And that's not only just in the world, it's also within myself. And I've become acutely aware of the stories that I've been telling myself and how that may or may not be impacting my overall nervous system. And I think this is a conversation that, it's not unique to me. I think we all struggle with these things and they come in waves. And I think it's something that we need to pay a little more attention to because there is so much chaos right now. When I look at just Nova Scotia and what I've been kind of paying attention to and talking about, I'm highlighting the fact that our premier has an employment history that's relevant to what he's doing. We need to pay attention. That if we look at him strictly as a public servant, that perhaps we've lost the plot because he comes from an offshore jurisdiction where he has predominantly served the private sector. It's worth looking at. Specifically, last week, Premier Houston stepped down as Minister of Energy. And that made me go, oh, well, that's very interesting. Because when you look at his offshore experience, which was deep in the insurance and reinsurance industry, and because the Paradise Papers, which I've talked about before, have connected him to a company called InterOcean Holdings, which has deep ties in the insurance and reinsurance industry as it pertains to energy, we need to pay attention when someone who took over a ministerial portfolio as premier quickly puts it back. Now, there's many reasons why he could have done that. The NDP party is saying that it's because he couldn't lower power rates, so he had to step away. Other people are saying that it was just a conflict of interest and he shouldn't have been there. Other people are saying that it's the polling numbers. There's a bunch of things. But I think when we think about resource development, any development for that sense, like I think we have to look at whether it's the extraction of our natural resources and how we're converting what's beneath the ground, the wind, the water, into energy. When we're looking at our land development, when we're looking at highway or road infrastructure projects, we as the public only ever see the construction, right? We really start noticing it when the trucks show up, when the drills show up, when the boots are on the ground. But in order to get to that point, you have to secure investors. In order to secure investors and funding, you have to make sure that everything can be underwritten, meaning it can be insured. And underwriting and insurance also requires its own type of insurance, which is reinsurance. So when I'm looking at the scope of that and understanding and looking at Premier Houston through that lens, I'm seeing a very different story, right? What I'm seeing is potentially someone who has spent years dipping into their own personal network, understanding the industry, being in a province that's incredibly resource rich, understanding the challenges of converting those resources, and therefore intimately understanding the underwriting and insurance risks that have to be mitigated and explored before funding can be secured, before investment can come in, before developers can be start bidding on the projects, and before we can actually start seeing tangible results. Those are the things that move quietly in the background that we rarely ever see. And so something seems sudden and that it just appears, but it may have been kind of working for a really long time. Again, no one knows what Tim Houston is doing but Tim Houston. But these are the questions that I have. And I have a habit of asking them out loud. And then after I ask them out loud, I get a little crunchy. My nervous system goes a little haywire. Because again, when you're saying things that aren't in the common vernacular but make a lot of sense, your brain will start to tell you a lot of stories. We found out last week that during the cabinet shuffle, it's customary for the lieutenant governor to sign off and preside over a cabinet shuffle. But our cabinet shuffle, which removed Tim Houston as Minister of Energy, happened last Wednesday, but it was presided over by a judge. That was interesting. I didn't realize that. I heard about it from a political science professor that was on the radio. And it happened to come on the heels where I've been asking myself, whoever's listening, some of the people that I speak to on a regular basis, where's Mike Savage? Where has he been? We've not really heard anything from him. And because of the way legislature and executive council / cabinet is structured, we often only ever hear of the lieutenant governor in their capacity as lieutenant governor. And we tend to look at the more ceremonial roles and as it pertains to legislature. But legislature is not the business of government. That is the cabinet. And when you go to the lieutenant governor's website and you look at the about page, in the first 2 sentences, it tells you that the lieutenant governor is both the lieutenant governor for the province of Nova Scotia on behalf of the Crown and the CEO of the province of Nova Scotia, meaning the corporation, not the landmass. And so I'm always very curious about that capacity because you never publicly hear a lieutenant governor operating in that capacity. When we look at documents that come out of the executive council or the cabinet, you usually start hearing references to the lieutenant governor and council, which usually is your CEO, your president. It could be your minister of finance. There's a little mishmash there, but it's important because in any other scenario, if we had a problem with a corporation, be it Coca-Cola or Loblaws, Sobeys, just think of a large corporation, Bell, Rogers, Nova Scotia Power. When you look for accountability, you tend to go to the CEO. But when we think in terms of our government being the executive function of the government, not legislature, which used to be defined on the Nova Scotia website, but they have overhauled the website so much that all of this information has disappeared But if you use the Wayback Machine, you can usually go back and find it. At this point, you're going back at least 8 months to start finding these changes. When we think about that, it's like, well, what role does Mike Savage actually play? And if he was not going to be available for the cabinet shuffle, how quickly did this actually happen? And when I say not available, I mean he was at a convocation for the University of Cape Breton. And he was just there on the Wednesday. So then why do the cabinet shuffle on the Wednesday? Why not on the Tuesday? Why not on the Thursday? Like, I have a lot of questions. And again, talking about this out loud on the radio, and to the host's credit, and I really appreciate it when he has these follow-up questions, it's like, what are the lines of communication? Because from a political science standpoint, the political science professor was saying, what was the open line of communication between the office of the lieutenant governor and the office of the premier? My question is, what's the line of communication between the CEO and its president? Because a cabinet shuffle happens in that capacity. And so I have questions. And I always have more questions than statements, and questions than answers. And I think that can be an incredible superpower when we can choose to be more curious than we are certain. I think when we attempt to be certain or manufacture certainty in order to kind of satisfy our own belief systems instead of expanding them, we tend to get ourselves in a little bit of trouble. Like, these are the questions that I have. There's so many inconsistencies. And even over the news here in the past week and a half, things don't make sense. Someone explained it to me where it feels like the media right now is just being pepper sprayed with stories, and it's creating a lot of confusion. There's been a lot of walk back. We had the State of the Municipality speech by Mayor Fillmore saying, we are committed in the next 4 years to putting out 63,000 units. Then just last week, there was a statement put out by Kilmariet, one of the largest residential landlords in the province of Nova Scotia. Oh, are we going to battle the lawnmowers again? I'm hoping this is noise canceling enough, but right below my window. Anyway, then we had the largest real estate company coming in and saying, we're halting all development and construction projects because the market conditions don't require that we move forward. But yet we just had our premier commit to 63,000 units. Like, the math doesn't math. We had something come out about the stadium, wanting, again, the conversation about building the CFL stadium out by the airport, and statements that the mayor has been meeting with both the funding company and the development company, Shaw Group. Clayton Developments, which is a subsidiary of Shaw Group, then comes out and says, as the landowner, we're not doing anything with that land. So again, why are we having this conversation when all of the information is incomplete? And it feels like everyone is saying, like, look over here, don't look over here, and pay attention here, but don't look over here. Like, there's something that doesn't make sense. And I'm constantly looking at the larger like, just the larger landscape, to see if I can expand that perspective that I'm holding and ask better questions. Just yesterday, I posed a question to 2 of our sitting councillors where I'm looking at term limits of our city council. We have a massive issue in the HRM with our council. They're incredibly opaque. They're very hard to speak to. Nothing seems to get done. They appear to consistently move in opposition of the will of the public, and we have significant voter apathy here. I know it's an issue right across the board, and this is actually going to lead into the bigger conversation today. Voter apathy is a huge problem, which is ultimately civic participation. And my question stemmed from the fact that I've put together a workbook. And the workbook that I've compiled is a list of all of our districts, all of our current councillors based on the 2024 election, their tenure overall, what committees, boards, and appointments they've held, if they've held public office in any other capacity as MLA, MP, etc. I went and pulled every funding document from the last election, put it in a ledger, so I have a complete list of every donor for the mayoral and 16 councillors for that election. And then I have an extrapolated list that looks at recurring donors across council and mayor. And I overlay that over the boards and commissions because I'm just trying to get a bigger picture of what we might be looking at. And data is neutral, right? It's the lens that you put on it that tells you what you're seeing. But what was standing out to me in that list and what I brought to the councillors yesterday had to do with tenure, because we have 16 councillors. One has been there for 22 and a half years, another for 13 and a half. We have 4 that have been there for 9 and a half years. We have a contingent that's in the middle of their second term right now. They're at about 5.5, almost 6 years. And then we have 6 that are new. They've only been there for just under 2 years. And if the landscape of our council doesn't change significantly by the 2028 election, we're now going to have 10 of our 16 councillors sitting there for at minimum 12 years. They will be 3+ term councillors, which at that point you're getting into a career. And personally, I'm of the belief myself that politics shouldn't be a career, that public service is not a career, and that there's a tipping point. There's a tipping point in change management where usually around the 7-year mark, and it's the same in relationships, it's the same in our own personal patterns and beliefs. Like it gets really fractal when you start looking at it, but around the 7-year point, that's where patterns usually are set in. They're deeply ingrained, belief systems get lodged, your way of doing things becomes significantly harder to adapt and change. We tend to become really set in our ways. And so should we consider term limits on our council? Because our Municipal Government Act does not impose a term limit. It only requires that there's an election held every 4 years. Is it something that council should impose on itself, as Mike Savage had imposed campaign contribution limits a couple years ago? Because apparently up until 2016 we didn't have limits on our campaign contributions. So is it something that council should impose on itself, or at the very least, when we are scrutinizing a candidate, should their ability to have enough self-awareness to know I've hit my limit, I'm not going to overstay my welcome, 2 terms is sufficient in a space like that? Because after 2 years, the line gets blurry as to whether or not I'm serving the public or serving myself. What does that look like? And that was the question that I put to the councillors yesterday, which then turned into a 90-minute conversation that flowed into the open hour and became a larger public discussion, because this is a conversation that has been happening in the HRM for a really long time. And it was so interesting because the conversation shifted from should we have term limits on council to somehow morphing into the question, which I didn't ask, which is, would term limits reduce voter apathy and increase voter turnout? Because in our last election, our mayor got in with 30,000 votes, or like 32,000 votes. We only had 36% turnout in the last election. That tells you a lot about how people feel, right? And so the conversation was really interesting because some of the people that called in were former candidates. They've either run for mayor, if they run for council, and they had really interesting perspectives. And the same themes kept coming up, where they were door knocking, they were talking to prospective voters who would consistently say, you're a really nice guy, but you don't have the connections. I don't know that you can get things done. And so you can see where things start leaning towards the incumbent, and not necessarily just from a campaign contribution perspective and the finances that they can run, which absolutely plays a role. But and let me know in the chat if those lawnmowers are out of control, I'm hoping this is helping, but I have no idea. These guys are crazy. Anyway, it's not just from a campaign contribution, it's the interconnections, it's business connections. And it starts to really poke away at the fact that people just don't feel like their vote is worth anything. And I think a lot of people feel that way at every level of politics, that we participate in these elections, but what do they actually do? I have a whole other perspective on that, because when I look at an elected politician, I'm very well aware that their oath of office. I'm so sorry, you're right below me with whippersnapper. I'm very aware that when someone takes an oath of office, that they are taking an oath to serve the crown, not the people. In no way, shape, or form does a public servant take an oath to serve the people. And I'm always very aware of that. And so when I'm asking these questions, I can't even hear myself think. When I'm asking these questions of people and trying to get to the root of voter apathy, I'm not doing it from the perspective that an elected official is working on behalf of the people. I understand that they are there to work on behalf of the corporation that they've been elected to serve on. I think of them like a board of directors, if you will, and that I've given them my proxy to work on my behalf. And so I participate in the electoral process very differently, as in I don't, but I pay attention to it because I choose not to assign my proxy to these people, and I choose to retain my voice for myself, and I exercise it, and I exercise it often. But when people believe that they vote someone in and that that person should be listening to them, that they should be taking their opinions into consideration, and they repeatedly feel unheard, well, that's a different conversation. And so I've been thinking about this over the past few days, going, well, really that gets at the heart of the work that I focus on, why I created Sovereign Wealth, why I'm constantly looking at the internal agreements that we make with ourselves that become the external contracts that bind us. And so when we're thinking of how we show up and participate, whether it's in our communities, in our election process, there's a certain level of self-awareness, I think, that collectively we still need to develop so that we can start informing, so that we can start being, I shouldn't say informing, but becoming more aware of where we are handing off our agency, where we are handing off our personal accountability and responsibility, where we are expecting other people to do, be, say, and act in ways that we're not. And nothing will show you that more than an election. Nothing will show you that more than an election, in the amount of people that show up, the people that get in, and then the backlash and the response that follows. And so I thought it was really interesting, the conversation that was spinning out yesterday, because what was repeatedly coming up was they don't listen to us, we don't feel heard, the incumbents have a hold on the large donors and people of influence in their area. The one comment that I thought was really interesting was someone was speaking about the South End of Halifax and saying, well, he only got in with 1,600 votes. Great. Now you know the bar is 1,600. That's low. You're in a major city, 500,000 people, and you're getting elected in one of the more affluent neighborhoods. That's 1,600 people. That tells you what you need to know about participation, right? We can condemn or feel a certain way about people of influence and how they impact elections, but you can't deny that they're not participating. They have figured out how to participate, and they have figured out how to participate for their benefit. That participation is available to everyone, and it's not just bound to dollars and cents. But what I find most interesting is the councillor's response to term limits was that I don't think we need term limits, which I would expect them to say. I don't think we need term limits because we need the institutional knowledge that sits in those spaces. And then that opens a larger conversation for me, again, about participation, which is, if we have a historical council right now, where we've had people in for 2, 3, 7 terms, not 7, 6 terms, and we're not happy with the direction of council, is there institutional knowledge? Like, how valuable is it? Like, what's the value that we're putting on it? And is that knowledge, which is coming through their lens and perspective, accurate? And is there a simultaneous record that I can refer to get that same data? And I think when we look at people in elected officials and elected capacities, there's no competency test, there's no proficiency test to get into those spaces. We tend to look at work history, we look at community involvement, but that doesn't tell me if you know how to go look for a record. It doesn't tell me if you know how to read the documents that are in front of you. It doesn't tell me that you know how to use a dictionary to verify the definitions of the words that you may have large assumptions on and potentially assume incorrectly and make a really bad decision. It doesn't tell me that you have the confidence to stand in opposition to your other council members and stand in your own ethics and morals and beliefs and to stand for your constituents. Like, there's nothing that can tell you that, right? In these particular comments, right? Just saying that someone has institutional knowledge, I think that's a lazy way of saying someone's going to do the work for me that I may not be capable of doing. That's a bigger question, right? So again, if as an individual, we don't sit back and look at how we choose to participate, how we choose to show up and take accountability and take responsibility for the people that we are handing our proxy to make sure that they are speaking on our behalf, have we actually failed ourselves first? It's a great question, right? The other question and criticism that I have is that if you, as an elected official, went in to serve the public, say you do your 2 terms and then you leave, why does it feel like our public servants stop serving the public once they leave? I have yet to hear a sitting councillor, and I'm going to focus on council because I'm focusing on the communication that comes out of this local radio station that we have, which is, to the best of my knowledge, the only station in Canada that has sitting council come every week where the public can actually speak to them, because God knows you can't talk to them anywhere else. They constantly have the mayor, the premier. They have open lines where the public can communicate. It's one of the few small spaces outside of social media, which is a bit of a dumpster fire, where something is slightly moderated and direct access can occur. I've yet to hear a councillor go in that space who is no longer there and say, as a councillor, this is what I'm contractually bound to do. And as the public, if you want to hold me in my jurisdiction and make sure that I do my job, this is how you must communicate to me. And I don't know if they're not saying that because the oath prohibits it. I don't know if they're not saying it because they, in fact, themselves don't know. I don't know. But it feels like public service disappears when they're no longer paid to be a public servant. It's like the stewardship, the continuity disappears. And I don't know why there is this idea that we must have legacy knowledge in the room and in there, and that there's no access to it outside of the room. That someone can't pick up the phone and call a former sitting councillor and ask for advice. That tells me there's no stewardship. And there's a big difference between governing and stewarding something. And we've lost stewardship. But we can't expect these systems to be self-stewarding if we don't know how to steward ourselves properly. Again, always going back to the participation piece. I don't know how many times I've heard that. We've lost that stewardship piece of ourselves. And so the big theme, again, that I was encountering this weekend were self-honoring agreements. And what are the agreements that I've made with myself as to how I want to show up in my life? And where am I acting from the agreements that I've made? And where am I still a little crunchy when I'm looking at things that are popping up in front of me and attempting to operate from a boundary? Because boundaries, as necessary as they can feel, tend to get thrown up when we don't know what else to do. They tend to be a very severe nervous system reaction. And in the healing space and in personal development and self-help, boundaries are usually revered as the way you reclaim agency. We may have to switch the time on these calls. I may have to do it. These guys were supposed to show up on Wednesdays, and they've started showing up on Tuesdays. Anyway, I digress. We throw up boundaries to try and control our space, right? But I wrote an article on this probably about a year and a half, 2 years ago, about the difference between boundaries and self-honoring agreements. And a boundary is akin to building a fence to keep the wind out. It's like you've now put up a fence. It's now something you have to maintain over time, but the wind's still going to come through, right? Boundaries become something that you have to explain, you have to hold, you have to maintain. They're a lot of work. They're a lot of work. But a self-honoring agreement is an agreement that you make with yourself where you just go, I'm just not going to let that in anymore. You don't have to explain it. You just have to be it, right? This is where the don't talk about it, just be about it starts to come into play. And so I think this is the internal battle that I'm constantly in. When I'm thinking about how I want to communicate publicly, convey what I see, add a different lens and perspective to what we might be looking at. But it gets a little murky when I'm talking about our public system because it feels like I'm being highly critical of our governments, of our politicians, when in fact I'm using them like a really solid mirror. I'm choosing to say what we're seeing outside of us didn't just come out of anywhere, right? It is very much a reflection and an effect of how we choose to conduct ourselves every day. That's why I always say everything is an inside out process. It starts with you, how you choose to show up in your life, how you choose to interact with the world. It gets reflected back to you, and that can either be catalyzing or self reinforcing. And you can either choose to expand your perspective when you see that and see if there is a different question that you can ask, that you can look at the issue in front of you, or you can choose to you can choose to argue with what's in front of you instead. And it starts to expand the conversation into loyalty. Like, what are you actually loyal to? And self-honoring agreements are tied very closely to loyalty. But in the HALT framework, where you have honesty, acceptance, loyalty, trust, in that sequence, you have to be able to get radically, brutally honest with yourself. Who you're being, why you're being that way, how you're choosing to show up in your world, what you're allowing, what you're not allowing. Accept that you're here in this moment right now. You're not living back there. You're not living ahead. The consequence of your choices are in front of you right now. It's what you're being in this moment. You can forgive yourself and keep going, or you can choose to live in denial, choose to live in the past, choose to project into the future. But at that point, your loyalty is compromised, right? What you're choosing to be loyal to. And are you choosing to be loyal to the aspects of yourself that require self-betrayal and unnecessary compromise and agreements that dishonor you? Or are you going to choose to be loyal to the truth, loyal to the present, even if you don't like it, and start building the muscles and the habits that will teach you over time to start trusting yourself? And so when I talk about people not having trust in the systems around them, not having trust in their council, not having trust in their neighbors, not having trust in their spouses, not having trust in their children, like, it's fractal and it emanates from the inside out. Trust will always be an inside out endeavor. But when we can learn to witness what's happening around us and identify the mechanisms of trust outside of us, it starts becoming almost impossible to not see inside of us how we may be participating in the degradation of that trust. And as I was saying at the beginning of this episode, when I have these conversations in public, and specifically when I'm being critical of our governments and of our leaders, I feel great in the moment, and then I get really crunchy afterwards. Because in the moment, I know that I'm in alignment with what I believe. I'm in alignment with what I'm seeing. I truly feel like I have a perception and a perspective that is valuable to the conversation and the greater conversation. But then the aftershock comes in when I realize that what I've said is not as normal or common knowledge to other people, and that while it may be a public record and it may be a public document, it doesn't mean people know what's actually happening. It becomes very easy for me to fall back into self-betrayal and not want to use my voice and not want to share my perspective and get a little paranoid. And so it's this constant kind of ebb and flow with myself of doing this work that I talk about. Going through HALT, understanding your CJC, which is your capacity, your jurisdiction, and your contracts. Who are you? What role, what capacity are you occupying? Where are you standing? Are you at work? Are you at home? Are you in a council meeting? Are you in a grocery store? Like, where are you standing? What are all of the contracts that bind you to that position? Do you know who you are at all times? Because when you know who you are at all times, it becomes easier to identify who's standing in front of you. And when you can identify who's standing in front of you because you know who you are, that's where you start not needing boundaries and you can start operating from self-honoring agreements. because we stop expecting an apple to be an orange. We stop expecting, in the case of Tim Houston, a private finance offshore professional to be a public servant. We stop expecting our counselors, who are career politicians, to serve the public first and not themselves. And when that expectation can change, because it's changed within you first, you are going to start participating differently. You're going to ask better questions. And ultimately, I think that's what I'm always shooting for and hoping for, and wishing to maybe inspire in other people to be a little audacious, to find a little of that inner tenacity, to say the quiet parts out loud and not be afraid of what other people are going to say or do in response to your truth. But I struggle with it just like everyone else. And I thought it was so interesting because I actually wrote this book 2.5 years ago, but only published it in March. And it's the Daily Sovran. And so for me, I created a daily book. I call it a devotional. And it's just one passage every day where you can reflect. We see it with like Daily Rumi or like the Daily Stoic. But unlike those books, I didn't create this on the Gregorian calendar. It's a seasonal devotional. It runs through spring, summer, winter, fall, and it runs through the 13 weeks with 7 days in each. So it's a little more cyclical with our own natural rhythms, while also understanding that just because we may be naturally or outside of us in spring, we might be experiencing winter within. And so it gives you a lot of opportunity to kind of move through your own season of life, whether it's in accordance with what's happening around you or maybe in opposition. But ultimately, I wrote it for myself first, but it was, can I deepen my capacity to witness what's happening around me? Can I have a daily practice where I learn how to decharge everything that's happening, step out of the victim, villain, hero, pay attention to what's happening in front of me and not necessarily what I want to infer on it? And can I choose to see the world around me just a little differently? And it's so interesting because when I wrote this, every season has 13 weeks and it goes through a cycle. So every week has a different topic that I go through over 7 days. And so like the first week is orientation, the next is sensation, the next is response, interpretation, distortion, friction, choice, action, consequence, feedback, adjustment, integration, and closure. And every season goes through that. So it becomes so interesting because in spring, you'll move through that. In summer, you'll move through that. Different charges, different perceptions, but the underlying pattern stays the same. And right now, in the seasonal cycle, where I'm at in Nova Scotia, we are in week 11, day 5 of spring. And so I thought today's entry was a little kind of apropos to what I've been experiencing over the past couple of weeks. And it always just feels like a little nod, I think, from the universe, where it's like, yeah, you kind of got this right. And it's like, it feels like a gift from my past self to my future self when I read these back. And today's entry is smaller shift. There is a temptation, once something becomes clear, to make a grand correction, to change everything at once, to prove your sincerity through force. But some of the deepest adjustments begin quietly. They begin in the ordinary places where your life is actually lived, not the dramatic promise of who you're about to become. You leave one thing unsaid, You rest where you once would have pushed. You stop explaining what does not need defense. You tell the truth a little sooner. You no longer volunteer yourself when your own spirit has already withdrawn consent. Do not underestimate these small obediences. A life changes by them. What matters is not that the shift looks impressive, but that it's true enough to repeat, real enough to hold, honest enough to become part of the architecture of your days. A true adjustment doesn't always announce itself with fire. It arrives like a hinge turning, quiet, decisive, permanent in its own soft way. And to me, that is the embodiment process of a self-honoring agreement versus a boundary. You start to feel the difference when you stop accepting things that inherently feel in opposition to what you know to be true in this moment right now. Not what you thought was true 5 years ago, not what you believe could be true 5 years from now, because that's always in flux. And you have to give yourself the grace and gratitude to be able to move with that. Because what you, and then this is where boundaries for me always get a little tricky, because when you set a boundary, you've now said, this is a line, and it becomes really rigid. And that's where we sometimes don't give ourselves the permission to grow and to change and to expand. And having moved through my own season of having very hard boundaries and going through the pendulum swings, and as I said in the book, moving through the impulse of making the grand correction and being able to take a beat and take a breath and go, I need to look at this a little differently. Those are the things that will radically change the world around us. And so when I tie this into what I'm observing through the political landscape in Nova Scotia and how that is impacting each of us, council's not going to change through external pressure. They're going to change from the inside out when each councillor starts doing their own work, when they build their own self-awareness, when they have the ability to halt, when they have the ability to pause, when they have the ability to ask more questions, then make statements, when they have the grounded awareness and ability to challenge who they believe is in a position of authority, which would be anyone who has tenure over them. When they have the ability to push back on the mayor, when they learn how to stop handing their jurisdiction over to the solicitors and the administration on a regular basis, because every time they do that, they lose part of their jurisdiction and ability to govern. They've now taken something that was their responsibility and they've given it to someone else. But we do that all the time. We are constantly handing what should be ours, our responsibility, our accountability, and we're giving it to someone else. That is exactly what happens in an election. We elect someone, we think they're going to listen to us, they don't, then we feel victimized by it, we feel like there's nothing we can do, and that's simply not true. But until we can figure out how to hold that center within and start recognizing those patterns within us every time we betray a promise that we've made to ourselves, every time we say yes when we really mean no, every time we make a decision that could have a compromising effect on the people around us. Not saying that we are to be fully responsible for everyone around us, but you are responsible for the environment that you create and how you show up. And we are required to have an awareness of the impact our presence has on our environments that we inhabit. Nothing's going to change. There is nothing that can impose that on you. Those are the deep, deep shifts that have to come from within. And so the greater question is, how do we become the people who can occupy those spaces more effectively? How do we become the people that we feel are capable of standing in those positions of responsibility? Because unlike I'd say a lot of the sovereign groups who want to abolish government, I'm not of that mindset. I believe in hierarchy and heterarchy. I think every heterarchy has a hierarchy within it. But it has to come from a position of stewardship, and we're not seeing stewardship. And so this is why I have the trust effect. This is why I'm constantly speaking about capacity, function, governance, and continuity. Because when you can embody those functions, not roles, functions, you start to become more trustworthy to yourself first. And when you feel like you can be trustworthy, inherently trustworthy, only then will other people be able to identify that in you. However, you will never put trust in someone or something more than you trust yourself. And that's discernment. That's important. We have to be able to identify that, but it's always going to be inside out because you don't know what you don't know and you can't see what you can't see. And so it's always going to be a bigger conversation, and it's always going to feel a little philosophical and a little kind of airy-fairy. But I do think it's important to keep having, and I do think that we can't have conversations about politics and leadership and elections and governance and government without first looking at how we steward ourselves. Because at the end of the day, government is a place of participation. And it gets its power through participation. And as I've said repeatedly, participation is where you place your time, attention, and energy. So if you're placing your time, attention, and energy into waiting for someone to do for you what you're not already doing for yourself, you are going to be disappointed 100% of the time. Like 100% of the time. And so again, it's just always my goal to ask more questions, to be curious, to hopefully inspire others to do the same, to be willing to challenge their long held beliefs, to be willing to ask questions that you might not want the answer to be willing to be wrong, to be willing to admit that you've made decisions that have hurt people, to commit to maybe not doing that again, to the best of your ability again. No one's perfect. We're not striving for perfection, right? We're striving for consistency. And consistency will trump perfection 100% of the time. Because consistency is where trust either shows you it exists or it doesn't. It happens in consistency because people who can do something very consistently are consistently untrustworthy, or they do something consistently and they are inherently trustworthy. It shows up there. Consistency over perfection 100% of the time. So yeah, I think I'm going to end this here. I have no idea what we talked about. I don't even know if you could hear me for most of this. I was so distracted by the lawn company, and given that it's 10 o'clock now and they are gone, I'm either going to have to bump this an hour earlier or put it ahead an hour earlier, I think. But I will know when I hear back. I was hoping this little guy would cancel some of the noise, but I had no way of testing it on this platform to know if it actually did or not. So anyway, thank you for being here. I really appreciate it. If you're watching on the replay, I appreciate you too. And I hope you have a beautiful Tuesday. And I will see you here, maybe same time, we don't know, but definitely same day, same place next week.